Welcome to the Customer First Thinking Podcast, episode 25. My name is Stephen Shaw, the host of this podcast. In this episode, we interview Neil Bendle, one of the world's foremost authorities on marketing measurement and accountability. They are two solitudes, operating in isolated silos, regularly clashing with one another, insistent on their point of view. So why do finance and marketing act like they're on opposing teams? Why the rancor, the lack of respect, the budget skirmishes? For starters, they've never shared a common business vocabulary, using terms and expressions that are foreign to each other. And neither has much interest in learning a new language. Finance holds marketing in low esteem for their negligible financial acumen. Marketing sees finance as cost-cutting technocrats, risk-averse and short-sighted. Finance has no clue what marketing does, while marketing is unable to read a balance sheet. A big source of tension is their conflicting mandates. Marketing believes it has to spend money to make money, and subscribes to the adage that not everything that can be counted counts. Finance believes its job is to manage costs. Marketing is a cost center, in their view, whose spending powers must be kept in check. Perhaps the most acrimonious point of contention is their lack of alignment around the performance metrics that matter. For marketers, success usually means a gain in some intangible measure like brand awareness and preference. Marketers are giddy when their campaign results exceed expectations, whereas finance only cares about cash flow and operating margins. They insist on knowing how marketing intends to influence those key measures. And of course, marketing has no clue how to connect any of the metrics they care about to business outcomes. Marketing just knows intuitively that future cash flow depends on happy customers who love their brand. But finance wants proof of that assumption. The fact that marketing has no credible evidence confirms their bias that it's all smoke and mirrors. To finance, marketing is a world of make-believe, unaccountable, and at worst, delinquent. Yet for businesses to succeed, at a time when brand loyalty everywhere is up for grabs, finance needs to see marketing as an investment and not simply a P&L expense subject to arbitrary cutbacks. At the same time, marketing has to be more accountable, making spending decisions as though they were using their own money. Today, marketers have no idea how much impact their spending has on revenue growth. They just know the cost of running media ads. There are many deep-rooted organizational and cultural barriers in the way of a more collaborative relationship between marketing and finance. After all, finance looks at the business as a ledger sheet, where making your numbers is all that matters, while marketing is driven by more conceptual thinking and drawn to creative expression. The truth is, finance people will never make good marketers, and marketers will never make good accountants. Yet somehow they have to find common ground, learn to play off each other's strengths, and come up with a set of mutually acceptable measurement standards and models like brand or customer equity. They also have to work more closely together throughout the marketing planning process, approaching every spending allocation decision as a business case for investment. Marketing should play a key role in setting the short and long-term growth objectives of the business, while finance helps with the cost-benefit analyses and shows how to optimize spending, not simply curtail it. That job of developing accepted standards for the measurement of marketing is the singular mission of the Marketing Accountability Standards Board, a cross-industry forum of senior marketing professionals, academics, and finance experts under the chairmanship of Neil Bendle. A former accountant himself, who once served as the finance manager of the Labour Party in Britain, he's an associate professor of marketing at the University of Georgia and best known for the popular book he co-authored called Marketing Metrics, now in its 4th edition. I started by asking Neil why he crossed over from finance to become a marketer. So, well, let's start because you have quite an unconventional career path. You started out studying ancient history of all things. That was interesting. You moved into managerial accounting, and at one point, you served as the British Labour Party's finance manager, which is pretty cool. But then you moved into marketing, and now today you're one of the world's foremost experts on marketing measurement, which I kind of find ironic because marketing and finance have always been sort of mortal enemies. What made you cross over to the other side and become a marketer?
Yeah, well, to be honest, it's been a fascinating journey, and I'm not the sort of person that had like a life plan at the age of 6 and are just rolling out. You can see that there's a lot of sort of random moving around, and it kind of makes sense when you put it together. But each bit seems a bit odd. So ancient history, just passion of mine, really enjoyed it. But it clearly isn't necessarily what you're going to do for your career. So went into accounting. And working at I worked at KPMG for a while and worked in hospitals in London. Working in the Labour Party was fascinating, I think, because it's such a high-profile organisation, but still was very, very, let's say, untroubled by legislation. So it was felt almost like a sort of club type thing. So legislation came in. We brought in some legislation while I was there to try and regulate political parties a bit more. So the reason why I think this is relevant to what happened afterwards is that there is kind of a surprisingly sort of entrepreneurial feel to politics, in sort of all the good and bad ways you might think about that. There was just like lots of things you could get involved in. So I would chat to our direct marketers. I would understand what was going on that front. I would chat to various people. So I had some sort of idea of what marketing was. I still was absolutely an accountant, and I'm sure if you sort of looked at some of the things I said back then, thankfully they weren't recorded. This is all pre-social media. I'm sure some of it would make me cringe if I looked at it now. But, I certainly was learning a bit of marketing at the time. Went to do my MBA and sort of Paul Farris, who many of you will know, and certainly he's on. He was kind of my professor at Darden and sort of lead on the book, the Marketing Metrics book. Worked with Paul, and it became sort of fascinating. One of the things that Paul was very keen on was that marketing is about numbers. And, I certainly very much appreciated that. So I'm coming at it from a numbers background. And I kind of start to see, that is, that's interesting, and we can try and quantify that. Is it hard? Of course it is. Yeah, it's really hard. But we could try and quantify things, and we could try and sort of explain to people in finance what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so that's kind of, I sort of fell into marketing that way, as it were. I think there's so much in marketing that is valuable. And I think a lot of times marketers, and this is somewhat ironic, are not necessarily great at explaining to finance people what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I kind of see finance, if you think of finance, particularly accounting, as a language, you really need to understand that language to talk to people. And I think too many marketers have the idea that, they know they're doing something good and everyone else should kind of know that too. And you kind of think if you're a firm and you have that attitude, we've got great products, people should recognize that, you can't be a terrible marketer, really. And I think, internally you've got to think, how am I going to persuade these people that what I'm doing is valuable? And you kind of have to talk their language, or else they're just not going to get it. So a lot of what I try and do is try and persuade, marketers that, what they're doing is good and valuable, and they need to tell people how that is. And to do that, they're just going to have to explain it in the numbers. They might think it's hard to put things in numbers, and honestly, it often is. But the challenge is when a CFO is looking between two projects, they're doing some sort of comparison in their head. The choice is, do you want them to make up their own random comparison, which could be completely, strange and completely unintelligible to a marketer, or do you want to give them some tools to make that comparison and make that comparison well? And I kind of think as marketers, we need to help giving them the tools to make the comparisons well, or else they're just going to make the comparisons badly. They're not going to stop making the comparisons. there's only so much money to go around.
So you're alluding to the fact that marketers really have struggled to really win the confidence of not just the finance folks, but the C-suite. And I think generally I can say that CMOs, marketers are viewed as financial lightweights, may I put it that way, accused of occasionally speaking in tongues. That's the language barrier that you were just describing. Do marketers get enough training, in your experience, in how to talk to finance people in the language they need to use to be understood?
I think probably not. Certainly, I can obviously speak for universities probably more than anywhere else. And certainly one of the things that I've always been keen to do is to try and push the number side, push the financial side. If you're going to be a marketer, you do need to have the certain basic understanding of what the wider business is. And, why are people making the decisions they are? And some, you've got to assume that the C-suite, the finance people, are doing, let's assume they're doing their best for the firm. And assuming they are, how can you persuade them what they're doing? And to do that, you need to understand, you need to be able to pick up a set of accounts and understand what the financial statements are saying. I mean, one of the things I teach my students is just to, go to an investor relations page, print out the accounts. Now try and find the value of brand.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes they find something and everyone's really excited, and but most of the time, you can find any number of really brand heavy firms, and obviously the value of brand on the balance sheet is likely to be nothing, or sometimes they acquired it 20 years ago and there's some random number that someone at the time had some sort of idea what it might be, but 20 years on. So my colleagues, Kevin Keller and Roger Sinclair, who was a big MASB proponent, Roger and Kevin, talk about sort of the moribund effect, when brands go on a balance sheet and then that's it. And so you kind of get this weird situation where, the value of the brand, say it came on at 200 million, whatever, we just make up a number. It came on at 200 million. If it goes up, it's going to stay at 200 million. If it goes down, well, it will go down. And how, without getting into how we measure that 200 million, let's assume even that value is correct. So it goes down to 100 million, it's gone down to 100 million. So we know it can go down, but it can't go up. And then if it goes down and goes back up again, it won't go back up. So you'll have these completely different numbers. So a brand that was like very stable will stay at the same level. A brand that goes up and down will go down and not come up. And so you'll end up, even if these brands are worth the same at the end, they can have very different numbers in the accounts. There might be nothing in the accounts if it was developed internally. They might be at the original purchase value. If it was stable, or they might be at some value that was reduced to take account of the fact that the brand was thought to be less valuable at some point in the historic past. And so the accounts they're not really doing anyone any favors. And I'm not, I say that they're clearly not doing marketers any favors. One of the things we want to do is show what we're up to. And when you look at the accounts of a public company, the chances are you're going to have absolutely no idea what the marketers are up to from those accounts. I'm not even sure they're doing that much of a favor for financial accountants, to be honest. I mean, it's we can definitely talk about what we need to do differently or could do differently, but I don't think currently the situation is particularly great for anyone. And I think one of the challenges with marketers is we all think, collectively, I guess, think that financial accountants just kind of hate us or, want to do us bad. They don't. I mean, it's hard to measure the value of a brand. It really is. And so, there's a lot of challenges measuring the value of a brand, especially for an accountant. If they get it wrong, people are going to blame them. If they just say, well, it's nothing, and that's what the rules say, then it's pretty easy to put nothing in the accounts and you're not going to get that wrong. You know what I mean? Like,
well, it's an intangible measure, isn't it? That makes it hard for an accountant who's used to dealing with hard auditable numbers.
yeah, I mean, the accountants are really bad with intangibles, and to be fair, I'm trying to be like completely fair. Intangibles are hard. It's like if you've got a car, you've got a fleet of cars. You can look at the cars. We might have some argument about how dented that car is, or how much it's suffered over the last few. But we have a ballpark. We have a pretty good ballpark of what the value of a bunch of cars are. Brand, it's tough. We don't necessarily have a super clear definition of what we mean by brand. And so we don't really know what we're trying to value. And it's kind of, and then we don't really know the method we're going to use. And the accountants aren't absolutely convinced that that makes sense anyhow. And so you can see why it's such a challenge. So I kind of think there's a lot we can do. And one of the things I don't want to do is be negative, because I actually think there are some steps we can take and there is progress we can make. But that said, I think part of the problem is marketers get themselves into the idea that unless you've got an accurate brand valuation on the balance sheet tomorrow, there's no point. There's nothing. It's not going to happen. Wish it was in many ways, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. So what can we do in the meantime to get better than where we are?
Brand value is just one measure, and the bigger question, it seems to me, is not just proving the value of the brand. It's actually proving the value of marketing. How do marketers make their case to the CEO? And really the case comes down to, I have a budget, I'm spending on this, this, and this, and they have a tough time defending it when business is tough. Is it just too hard for marketers to prove incrementality? That is, hey, I want 5% more money than you gave me last year, not just a rollover of the budget, but they have no way to actually defend that money is going to have any kind of payback. Is that the central challenge for marketers?
It is a big challenge. And, in some ways, we have a fine balancing act between like wanting to say you can do this and then, also wanting to be seen as like reasonable and realistic. We don't want to be too rah-rah and, you just do this, it'll be easy, because it's not going to be easy. But there's an awful lot marketers can do, like just to sort of build credibility. And throughout our chat, we'll go through a number of different ways. But I mean, one thing I'll highlight. I'll get to MASB straight away. So as discussed, the Marketing Accountability Standards Board, what we're trying to do is bring accountability to marketing. And one of the things that Paul Farris and John Gasky, who's at Notre Dame, and their colleagues have been doing is just putting together definitions of marketing. What do we mean by marketing term? And so we got some originally, AMA. We got some AMA definitions. We got some definitions from our book. I think NA was involved in this. MSI. We've got now, if you go to it, so the Common Language Marketing Dictionary, we actually have a list of what is meant by terms in marketing. So one of the things I've been doing a lot of thinking about recently is the value of a customer. When we say we have a value of a customer, we should have that number. People should know what it means. And, if you go and see an accountant and say our customers are all worth $10,000, then, you should be able to justify that number. And I think, if collectively, and we've still got to work on some of these, if collectively we can work on like having sort of credible, clear, consistent definitions that, the accountants know what they mean. I mean, that's kind of one reason why accounting is powerful is because when you see a financial statement, there's clearly a lot of omissions, there's a lot of flaws in it, but you kind of know what it means.
Well, there's 100 years or so of practicing it that backs it up, whereas with marketing, it fundamentally keeps evolving and changing, becoming more complex, with hence the challenge with proving incrementality. Let's take the example of the rise of social media. Every marketer understands that they need to have a social media presence, but that requires an investment. How do you demonstrate ROI on investment in social media, for example? Where is the incrementality in that? How do you do a controlled experiment that proves, in fact, there's some lift associated with it? It's virtually impossible.
Yeah. There's a lot of challenges. I mean, social media, at least you can at least you can do experiments, which isn't necessarily true in everything. So I definitely think there's challenges there. But one of the things I think we can get to is having a clear model. If you have a model, you kind of put your assumptions on paper. And to be honest, one of the challenges, and I have a lot of sympathy with people who worry about sort of being too clear in their assumptions, because assumptions, when the assumptions turn out to be wrong, then you kind of look like a fool. But one of the things I think we've got to push people on is their assumptions, how they're, what their model of the world is. And we've got to try and start as marketers to get that model down on paper. Once we get that down on paper, I think we can start to improve it and start talking about, like, when we see great activity on social media, what do we expect the long-term consequences to be? Do we expect sales to raise, X in next year and the year after? What do we expect? Once we get that down, we can start to see where we're good and where we're bad. And we can start to actually improve our models. And I think where we're in a pretty good state at the moment is some customer-focused firms have pretty good data. So we actually have a potential there to start valuing customers in certain firms at certain times. And so if we can start doing that, that starts to sort of push the boundary of the unknown back, as it were.
Well, let me ask you about that, and that's a very good point. I mean, there's a large number of DTC companies operating today using first-party data. Direct marketers have been around a long time. That's my roots. I learned the trade through the direct marketing channel. Traditional catalogers, direct-to-consumer marketers, have long lived by customer measures, lifetime value, the very things that we talk about today. I mean, that model did exist at one point. When you're a direct-to-consumer, it's a little easier for a direct marketer in that case. Lots of data, as you say, to work with. A little harder, though, if you're marketing through intermediary channels. You've got e-commerce going on. There's a lot of stuff under the hood here. And isn't the challenge is at that point optimization of all of these tools, all of these channels, all of these methods today? And marketers struggle, it seems to me, even with all of that data, to make some of those calculations. Is the issue the fact that marketers don't think of the money they are given to spend as investments, that they're in fact viewed as spending decisions, and therefore it's hard for them to defend a spending decision versus an investment decision? Is that the central challenge here?
Yeah, I think that could well be, a great way of saying it. The reason why I think marketers, in some ways, marketers are bought into accounting terminology in a way they really shouldn't have. I should say most, an awful lot of what we do as marketers is an investment. Obviously it will depend upon firms, and different firms will do different amounts of investment versus things designed to generate immediate sales. But if it is an investment, we should be thinking of it as an investment. And that's one of the great things that customer lifetime value does. It allows you to start thinking about the customer as a long-term investment. And that's really helpful for marketers, because that's kind of often what we want to do. A lot of what you might try and argue is if we do this spending, the value of our customer base will go up because we're treating our customers better or whatever. That's a powerful argument. It's a much more powerful argument for the C-suite, certainly for the CFO, than we should just be treating our customers better because it's a good thing to do. If we start seeing things as an investment, that's going to be really helpful. Why do we not see things as an investment sometimes? Well, sometimes part of the problem is, I think marketers sometimes see, and certainly I see this with MBAs. So I teach various people. So I teach MBAs, I teach marketers, people who are marketing track. And when you see MBAs, they kind of think the finance numbers are better. and that if marketers can get to the finance numbers, then we're going to be great. But the problem is that some of the finance numbers, and particularly if you're basing this upon financial accounting, are actually not that great. If you kind of think about what sort of step back, think financial accounting, one of the sort of central points of financial accounting is matching. So the audience may have heard of matching before, and it's this, the idea is that your revenues and costs should be matched. So when the costs go out for an activity, the revenue should come in for that activity, and vice versa. If you think what happens in marketing, the costs tend to go out, and the revenues come back, later, 2, 3, 4, whatever, years later. And so the accountants are violating their own principle of matching by treating most marketing as immediate spend when it is actually an investment. So the accountants are making, actually kind of bad choices for an economic understanding of the world perspective. And I think sometimes, MBAs don't realize that the financial accounting numbers are there, and they're there for a particular reason. And it's not necessarily a bad reason. It's to avoid overstating the value of a firm. And they'll accept any number of choices that violate the matching principle in order not to overstate the value of a firm. That doesn't make the numbers accurate. It doesn't make them useful. And it certainly doesn't make them useful for managerial decision making. And so what we need to start thinking is, if we do have an investment, how do we account for it as an investment? It's great if we can change financial accounting. That's a big push, though. Financial accounting is not fast. They are not going to do lots of things quickly. We do need to work on it, but that's a sort of long-term, in the background, push away. But there's lots of things we can do in the short term or medium term. And I think so. Too many marketers don't understand that within within accounting, there's kind of two different branches. And I think certainly, maybe this is more for students, and you kind of work this out more once you've actually worked. But the financial accounts are, a particular form of accounting, but managerial accounting is kind of what should be driving the decision. Managerial accounting is really, to get into too much into accounting. I kind of think, managerial accountants, I'd love to see managerial accountants almost like take over accounting and then push financial accounting to the outer side of accounting. Because at the moment, I think people think that financial accounting is accounting, and maybe there's a few managerial people working in the corner there. But it's actually managerial people are the ones who, should be creating the information for managerial decisions. And that's kind of the vast majority of decisions that are made in respect of a firm. Obviously, funding decisions are important, and I'm all for financial accounting having a role. But I think financial accounting has kind of taken over managerial accounting. And I've even talked to CFOs who have said things like, managerial accounting can do anything it likes as long as it follows GAAP. And the whole point of managerial accounting is that it doesn't have to follow GAAP. That's kind of, if I was to define managerial accounting, it's accounting that doesn't follow GAAP. So, there's so many sort of ideas out there that actually harm this idea of marketing as an investment. I know I got into a long discussion over that. But if you think, if something's an investment and it can't be treated as an investment in financial accounting, that's one thing. But if something's an investment, it can be treated as an investment in managerial accounting. So marketers need to go and make friends with their managerial accounting buddies. They're the people, if you're a CMO, you want to be talking to the managerial accountants. You want to try and persuade the managerial accountants to be the kind of powerful people. You want to bring them up. I don't know how we help, we help a sort of internal power struggle within finance. But the managerial accountants, are the actual, they're our friends. They're the people who can actually start treating marketing as an investment. And, when we talk about customer lifetime value, we can talk about, the customer asset. there's no reason why we can't start talking about the value of the customer base as a serious number that we produce. We can produce it monthly, we can produce it daily. We can produce this number, we can have this number, and we can know where it is. And I think there's lots of things happening with, as prediction becomes cheaper, find an algorithm to predict almost anything nowadays. As long as we have a clear idea of what we mean by customer lifetime value, then we can get algorithms that help us predict it. And there's certain firms will be able to have a very clear idea of what their customer asset is. And then they can sort of say, look, our customer asset is actually worth 20, 30 times our fleet of cars. It's worth 20, 30 times our property assets. Yet, why do we spend our whole time, monitoring the fact that no one's stealing the paper clips while we have no idea what the customer asset is worth? It just doesn't make sense.
I'm going to go back, though, to the complexity of it all. And marketers have a tough job. As I was alluding to earlier, in this omni-channel world, how on earth do you understand the interaction effect of the various channels on spending decisions and ultimately on cash flow? Is part of the challenge here that marketers have, in fact, too much data, or they don't know how to create a hierarchy around those metrics, and they tend to lean on vanity metrics because that's easy, likes and followers and that sort of thing, versus more strategic metrics that are longitudinal in nature, don't change as quickly, but clearly it's easier to draw a direct link to the bottom line with those types of measures versus the activity, what I call activity measures. It's part of the challenge here that marketers tend to look at these metrics in isolation. They don't synthesize the different types of measures into a more integrated framework that I call it a cascading scorecard, that actually allows them to see the correlative effect of one measure changing and impacting another measure and that changing and so on. It doesn't seem to me there's much even literature around this particular subject of integrated measurement frameworks.
No, I think that's great, and that's something that we've talked about. And basically, I agree with you. There's not a lot out there. You can see why people go for the vanity metrics. They're easy. You can find them. They're reported. On a more positive note, they're kind of they're usually provided by a third party. So you can kind of say, but how they fit together is often a puzzle. I mean, if you think, one of the things we discussed was, and we've got this in our book, is the DuPont model of how you put together all the different drivers of the firm profitability, as it were. And I think that's a really cool model. Obviously, it's old, and it's not going to sort of work for everything we do nowadays. But that sort of basic idea, and I think it's the idea you're alluding to there, how these things fit together. What drives what? How do we show those connections? And it's great if you've got more followers on Facebook. I can understand why the C-suite would say, our job is not to maximize the number of followers we have. No one's that interested, really. You do need to kind of link through and say, what's that driving? What does that imply? If this is meaningful, what do we expect to see happening with, if we're driving, will this drive more reviews? If we see more reviews, do we expect to drive more sales? You can kind of try and get through that sort of logic of where, obviously it'll depend upon the firm exactly what the logical chain is, and it'll depend on what data you can get hold of. If we have a logical chain, then it's much more convincing to anyone else, to the C-suite, and it'll hopefully create more sort of influence on marketing. And one of the things we're doing at MASB at the moment, and it's still fairly early stages, is we are looking into this whole sort of problem of the CMO role, and what does the CMO do? What was the CMO expected to do? And obviously, every now and then you see a depressing headline about CMOs and how quickly they get fired and stuff. And I think there's been some some progress.
They're an easy scapegoat, aren't they?
Yeah,
and things go wrong.
Yeah, and because no one quite knows what they're doing, they can't say, "Well, I took
sometimes they don't know what they're doing."
So you can see one of the things I think we need to do is to build the influence of marketing and build the influence of the CMO. You've got to try and tie back to something that someone who isn't a marketer cares about.
But let me ask you about this because it puzzles me. There is no manager of integrated measurement in any marketing department that I know of, right? It falls into the purview maybe of a marketing analytics person who's usually an intermediate to lower level analyst who can't actually explain the data that they're collecting, never mind prove it to a skeptical CFO or even CEO. Isn't that a curious gap? You have all these technicians today in marketing, specialists, but no one really directly in charge of marketing measurement.
Yeah, I honestly, I'm with you. I think it's puzzling. I just don't, I don't understand sometimes why we do what we do. And we're bringing in great analytics talent. Some of the analytics talent is fantastic in marketing nowadays, but it often doesn't seem to connect up, and I don't know why. I don't know why. Maybe it's because some of the analytics talent is coming from more of a sort of maybe sort of data science, computer science type background, and some of them honestly are working to get a marketing background themselves. So the chance of them getting a marketing background and then getting that to a further broader business background is maybe a step too far, certainly in the short term. But I kind of think it's a real challenge. I mean, think from an educational background, obviously, being a professor, I think about this a lot. One of the things I do value is a sort of more general management perspective. That I think gives potential to kind of bring in that sort of integrated thinking. And I try and teach students that. In some ways, I almost wish we weren't. And I know this is just me being sort of overly naive, but I almost wish we weren't teaching sort of marketing and finance and accounting and operations, but actually we're teaching sort of more generally and sort of interdisciplinary teaching. And there's lots of reasons why us as professors don't want to be too interdisciplinary, without going into academia too much. You have to impress your colleagues, your marketing colleagues, in order to be a good marketing academic. What the accounting academics think of you doesn't matter to anyone, and vice versa. So, we all do tend to silo. As academics, we silo. I think we probably train students who come out and silo, firms silo, and it's a major problem.
Well, even within marketing ranks, you see a great divide between brand marketers who argue for top of funnel measures and performance marketers today. And unfortunately, to some degree, the performance marketers are winning because it's easier to prove last touch attribution and hey, I'm responsible for that sale. Forget all the brand building you're doing today because no one's paying attention to advertising anymore.
Yeah, no, I can see where you're going with that, and that's a big challenge. I mean, I think as brand, people who are interested in brand, I think need to sort of embrace the idea of measurement. And I think part of the problem is that people will say this is imperfect. And I kind of think we just need to say, yes, you're correct. It's imperfect. What's your point, sort of thing? Because I think at the moment, actually, if you just look at any measures, like everything in life's imperfect. Of course, some things are more imperfect than others. But, we tolerate imperfection when it's, when the numbers we get are useful. And I think with brand, we've just got to start accepting that, okay, we're doing our best. This is not perfect. When we've got a number, could it be off 10%? Yeah, it could be. But it's still better than I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. And I think one of the things we're pushing at MASB is this idea that, a firm should be thinking about the value of its marketing assets. My colleagues, particularly brand, you should have an idea what that is. And you can see how that makes a big difference to your choices. I mean, even when people are talking about sort of wider discussions about what the firm should be doing, how that affects your brand is going to be a big discussion point. And honestly, if you think your brand's worth nothing compared to you think you're worth 5 billion, it's much easier to argue that we need to protect this asset that's worth 5 billion than this asset that looks to the accounts and it's worth nothing, is it? So I think it gives marketers that sort of extra tool that they really need to justify what they're doing. And in return, we need to accept that the numbers are not perfect, but we can tell people where they came from. And I think that's key. We can't just like have a number that's imperfect, someone just made up. But we need to have some justification for the number, and we can see that over time. I mean, the cool thing about the sort of the numbers we're talking about is, even if an individual number is not great on any given day, often the movement in that number might be indicative of something anyhow.
Well, that's what I was trying to say earlier, maybe not very well, is the correlative effect, to watch these numbers move in tandem. And we make certain assumptions that this number relates to this number. And if we see an increase, therefore, what's the causal effect? Very hard to do. One of the things that MASB has done, which is very effective visual aid, is this chain of marketing effects diagram that you created. I thought that was quite brilliant. It's the first time I'd really seen that done. But it makes the attempt to draw the line between marketing investments and ultimately business outcomes and financial health measures.
Yeah, I don't want to take any credit for that myself, but I think it's very helpful just to try and get how do we get from our activities. And it kind of like that sort of integrative idea when we were talking sort of DuPont type model, the integrative type idea that we can go from one side to the next and see that chain is really important. And I think the more marketers can think that way, the more marketers can start saying, what I'm doing is going to affect this and this is going to affect this. And I think it's actually pretty useful and kind of helpful for marketers as they begin and continue their career. Because when you start your career, presumably you're taking hold of some relatively small part of a big operation. It's kind of nice if you know why you're doing it, really. Just from a purely sort of inspiration perspective, if you know that your activity should affect this and should affect that, that's great. If you just think, I'm doing this and I don't know why. So I'm hoping from a sort of just a pure junior marketer perspective, they might be kind of interested to see how they fit into the organization anyhow.
Well, I came into marketing when there was such a thing as below the line and above the line. Those lines have virtually disappeared now. And as a direct marketer, I'd watch the budget vacuumed up by the ad folks who insist that's the way to drive sales. And you're always trying to make the argument that no, DM should have a bigger role here, blah, blah, blah. And today there's still a divide, still all this money going into digital advertising and search engine marketing and so on and so forth. Versus, say, investments in relationship marketing. And those arguments continue to go on today in terms of budget allocations. I want to come back to the question of brand value, which we started off talking about. And I think MASB, again, has done analysis that showed a brand is worth an average of almost 20% of corporate value, yet businesses, and we talked about this earlier, don't measure report brand value per se on their books. It's kind of hidden under goodwill. But ISO now has published, I think, a methodology to conduct more systematic brand evaluations, try to find what that actual number is. Will that give marketers eventually the framework they need to draw that linkage to financial health that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I'm really excited about what is going on there. As I say, this is a slow process. So MASB is actually the representative on the ISO standards board. So it represents the US through its association with ANSI. So there's a couple of big ISO standards that are relevant. There's an old brand valuation standard, which is about 12 years old now, I think, something like that, which is, I remember the number, ISO 10668. And that was talking about monetary brand valuation. That's helpful. I think we can push that one further, to be honest. I think it's still fairly kind of high level, but it's got some interesting stuff in there. More recently, a couple of years ago, the brand evaluation standard came out, and just probably people listening appreciate the difference. But sort of valuation, by valuation, we just mean, putting a dollar value on it, whatever X dollars, whereas evaluation is kind of more holistic, kind of less dollar based. So the brand evaluation standard came out, which is 20671. And I think that's really kind of helpful at sort of trying to sort of get people on the same page as to what a brand is and what do we mean by like a healthy, effective brand. Now, the exciting thing about that, I mean, Bobby Calder, who's at Northwestern, was heavily involved in this, and a lot of my sort of colleagues at MASB, as well as obviously representatives from all sorts of different countries, and China was heavily involved as well. So there's been a lot of work on that, and I think there's a lot of work that can be done in that area. So if we can get international standards together on what we mean by brand value and brand evaluation, then we can start sort of having sort of more sort of credibility when we talk about what a brand is. And so I think an international standard setting body is slower than like if MASB were just do our thing on our own, and maybe we'll do some stuff on our own. But an international standard setting body has that sort of cachet that we can go to.
Yeah, it has an imprimatur really over the adoption of these frameworks,
and it can be really a valuable thing. And most business people have heard of ISO standards. Certainly ops people will have encountered them many years for many years. And so we can see how they're helpful. They get things to fit together. We get people to understand what we're talking about. So, we're going to be pushing more on that, and hopefully we can sort of get more successes in that area to ensure that sort of when you see a brand evaluation or a brand valuation, you have a much sort of better idea where it's coming from, what it is, what it's going to mean. And so I'm really excited by that side of work. And you can apply these principles, in your everyday. To get back to managerial accounting, I know I get back to managerial accounting a lot, but you can apply these principles in your everyday business. You can talk to your managerial accountants and talk about how you start evaluating your brands, how you start putting a value that you continue to monitor on your brands. And I think at MASB, we did a quick survey of organizations, and I think we got, don't quote me too much on the number, but it was like about a quarter of firms saying they were doing some sort of continual brand valuation. But kind of when we pushed them, that number was really soft. What they were actually valuing was, it wasn't quite to the level we wanted it to be. So I think we've got a long way to go. But I think once you've got ISO and you've got like the international community coming together, it makes it so much more powerful, and it kind of gives marketers a sort of a voice.
A validation. Yeah, validation. I want to move into a slightly different subject area, but obviously related. And we talked about this earlier, which is the whole question of customer metrics. And I think you had talked about that issue of looking at the customer portfolio, my words, not yours, as an investment, both short and long term. You've written that the general idea of viewing customers as assets, as I just said, is a powerful one. You've said that yourself. Now, you weren't too fussy about the concept of customer equity, and it's one of those terms like brand equity that cause the eyes and the head of a CFO to roll backwards. But is defining the value of a customer now, today's present value, and in that future present value, isn't that ultimately the most powerful way we could guide business and marketing strategy. After all, business is in the business of creating and keeping customers. Ultimately, you don't have a business without a customer.
I suspect, you know what I mean. I suspect we have a good amount of agreement here. I mean, I'll say one of the reasons why. You can certainly say I'll give a plug for my website. So neilbendle.com's got a load of my thoughts on life.
It's terrific. I love that website, by the way.
Thanks. And that's where I sort of go on a bit of a rant about customer equity. And the reason why I'm doing that is not because I don't think the basic concept is good. It's a great basic concept, and I just want to call it customer asset. I want to be very clear. It's a customer asset. Once you start calling it customer equity, I think it just vagues everything up a bit. We're not quite sure what it is. So I have a great deal of respect and appreciation for people who came up, with the early work in this area, and I think they did a great job. But I kind of think we could just stop with the customer equity stuff. Just call it a customer asset, and we'll be good. We can perhaps reserve customer equity for sort of more sort of less sort of value-based measure, less dollar-based measures, as it were. But the reason why customer equity, I think, doesn't work for accountants is there's a sort of very basic, if anyone knows the accounting equation. So, the fact that it's called the accounting equation tells you it's sort of pretty basic to accounting. And assets minus liabilities equals equity, ALE. So that's basic. That's basic accounting. And so when marketers use the term equity is something that falls out of a set of accounts. You have the assets, you take away the liabilities, the equity is the remainder. It's the bit you can't measure. It's the bit that kind of appears, but you can't really justify it too much. You can justify the assets, you can justify the liabilities, but the equity is just what's there when you've justified everything you can justify. And that's kind of completely the wrong message we want to send. I want to send the message that customer assets are an asset and we can justify it. We can give a value to customers. We can list our customers. We know this customer, admittedly, I'm in best case scenario now, but let's be best case scenario. You've got a firm, you've got Netflix, you've got a firm, you know who your customers are, you know how much they're paying you each month, you know what their chance of being retained each period is. Once you've got that, they can come up with a pretty accurate view of what the value of that customer is. Add those together, and you've got a customer asset. It's not actually super. I mean, when I say it's not super complicated, I appreciate that. There's a lot of work in the background. I'm completely minimizing here, but it's the concept, the basic idea is not that hard, and we can point to those customers. We know that Stephen's worth X dollars, Neil's worth X dollars. There's nothing magic about this. So I think we can come up with this customer asset number that's a really good number. And it's a good number that, as I say, different firms will have different ways of doing it, and some will be more successful than others. But best case scenario, we can go to the accountants and say, this is the sort of number you like. It's a number that you can audit. It's a number we can show where the assumptions are coming from. So I'm doing some work at the moment. I'm talking about sort of the idea of some of our measures of customer lifetime value. We need to make them very well defined. And I'm always talking about sort of a minimalist view. So I kind of think in marketing, sometimes we get trapped into this idea that we need to throw everything into every measure. And I think with customer lifetime value, that's a terrible mistake. If you start throwing in the value of word of mouth and things like this, it's not that word of mouth isn't valuable, it really is, but it just becomes ridiculously complicated, ridiculously quickly, and then you've just lost the entire.
Well, that's the sort of NPS discussion around the value of a referral. But I just interviewed Fred Reichheld, and terrific guy and lovely to talk to, and very articulate, and makes the case that in his newest book, Winning on Purpose, that the only way to crack the code here is to come up with what he calls earned growth rate, which really is a way of saying the cross-sell value of a customer combined with the value of a referral to bring in a new customer. If you could calculate that, he argues, then you could prove the value of marketing. is he right? Is that the right formula here to really convince the finance crowd that marketing is worth the investment?
I actually I think he's done some great work. In some ways, I'm fascinated by him. I don't know him personally, but I'm fascinated by his work because he's done such a good job of putting let's call NPS a marketing metric on the map, in a way that I can't, it's hard to imagine who else has done that. So he's done a fantastic job, but some of the NPS was like oversold a little bit. Let's be honest. Um, and so background, I come from a Irish family. We all like Guinness. It's great, but Guinness I always use the example of Guinness. They always used to have that slogan, "Guinness is good for you." Guinness is great. It has many good things, but it's not a health product.
It's not bad medicine.
Yeah. Don't believe everything that's said about it. I think with NPS, it's pretty similar. It's got some good points, but don't believe all the hype. So on earned growth, I've been reading that and I've been looking at what's going on, and I think it's got potential. You know what I mean? I'm not. It's the whole quest to get the sort of one number, I think is probably somewhat doomed. But then again, I appreciate this. I do appreciate the feeling that we need to get to something simple that can explain. So I'm kind of a bit mixed. I think earned growth has some nice qualities. You know what I mean? And as I say, I want to think about it a bit further before I go too far down that. But it's got some nice qualities. I'd be surprised if we could all just use that number and all that. Yeah.
So just to flip that for a second, you're obviously familiar with Byron Sharp, and he's quite the contrarian. He views himself as a marketing scientist. That's how he self-describes. He scoffs at the idea of a loyalty ladder. He says that ignoring light buyers, which is the idea of investing in relationships, it prevents growth, that it erodes market share. So he's got the opposite point of view, that expanding your market share as much as possible is the path to sure growth, as opposed to focusing on existing customers. He's using metrics for the opposite reason to some extent that Fred Reichheld is. What's your point of view on his worldview?
I mean, one of the things I was going to say, I always like to see myself as somewhat like neutral, and I know that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but the reason why is I'm dead keen on, like, we know what the numbers do, we know what they mean. As long as we get them clear, then we can let them battle it out, and we can see which one actually turns out to be correct in the end. At the moment, I don't think our use of numbers is collectively, as marketers, our use of numbers is good enough that we can come up with some grand statements. So I try and avoid too many grand statements. We're just saying, I appreciate the people who do make grand statements, and hopefully we can test it out and see what goes. And honestly, there's always a chance that some advice is going to make sense to some people at some time. Some other advice is going to make sense to some other people at some other time. That's usually the way life ends up working, isn't it? But let's see how they fight out in the meantime.
So let me, in the few minutes we have remaining here, Neil, there's a couple of key questions for me, and one is, again, we'll go back to the central challenge is proving to the C-suite that marketing matters, that the investment is worthwhile, and that the difficulty is translating marketing's jargon and acronyms and measures into something meaningful that a CFO can relate to. Is it possible, I'm just throwing this out there, to really come up with really two killer measures around the health of the brand, which matters and isn't always related to how many customers you have, obviously. There's a lot that goes into the distinctiveness of the brand, its track record, its reliability, et cetera, that matter to the enterprise. Apple's a good example of that. and customer health, which is how do people feel about the company, their relationship with the company, whether they want to go out of their way to buy the products from that company. Those two areas of measure. Is it feasible to roll up that to two scores, a brand health score and a customer health score? And in the end, if those are going up, the business should be doing well. Is that even within the realm of possibility?
That sounds very challenging, but it's a noble goal. So if I can kind of sort of say, I think there's certainly things we can do a lot better than we're doing at the moment. I would, who knows what we'll be doing in 30 years' time, but I'm certainly not seeing it at present.
So there's no magic formula or magic wand we can wave here. Then I'm going to close out our conversation today with asking you a really loaded question. So last year, the Association of National Advertisers came out with this study, I don't know if you saw it, suggesting that marketers look mostly at the wrong metrics. And we've been talking about that, things like vanity metrics. So you're sitting opposite the CEO of the company. He asked you this question: what are the top 5 metrics we should be looking at carefully to know whether marketing is making a contribution to the growth and health of our enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, part of the challenge with this is everyone always wants 5 metrics, and I've talked to Paul Farris or 10 metrics. And one of the kind of, if you see the first edition of our book, we kind of subtitled it, it's a marketing metrics, 50 plus metrics. And some people got very angry because we didn't count the number of metrics. And part of the problem was we weren't quite sure what, is unit market share different to revenue market share? So, you know what I mean? So there's like some technical things there, but mostly we kind of like thought it was kind of funny not to put a precise number on the marketing metrics. But we got rid of that because people wanted these are the 76 marketing metrics. I don't think it's possible for across all companies to have like the 5 metrics you need to know. It doesn't mean that there aren't 5 metrics for your particular company that might be the ones you need to know. But the 5 across, it's just hard to imagine, Netflix and P&G, Apple, and and your small, your small window replacement firm in somewhere in Georgia, are all going to have this. It's just not. I think that's too hard. And the good news for marketers is, the good news for us is that we get to write lots of different metrics. The good news for marketers in general is, there's a reason for you to sort of, one of the skills you're bringing is saying this is what's important to us. So, marketers have to bring in their own skills and show why they're the ones that can help manage the firm. And if we gave them the 5 metrics they needed to know, it'd be too easy.
Maybe that's the subject of your next book. Are you going to come out with a 5th edition, or do you have plans to develop some of the concepts we've been talking about today?
The 4th edition's only a couple of years old. We'll see. I mean, I think we'll talk to the publisher about whether we'll do a 5th edition. We've got some ideas. If we do, we'll see how that goes. It'll probably be a few years before we'd update anyhow. I've personally been doing a lot of thinking about customer lifetime value. So when we talk about the customer asset thing, I do have like a little book ready on customer assets. We'll see where that goes. So that's what I'm personally going to be working a lot on. But there's so many things going on. I mean, I'll give a shout out to, we mentioned MASB. Please go to find out more about MASB. I think that we've got a lot of exciting things going on. I think hopefully some of your listeners will be interested in that. So there's some cool things going on. And MASB, we've got lots of projects going on with Sumo Roll, and I think some colleagues have been talking about digital accountability. We did a bunch of stuff on sponsorship. So there's a whole lots of work going on there. As I say, customers is where my head currently is.
And good, because that is sorely needed in the literature. I can tell you that quite affirmatively. I have lots of books on my bookshelves behind me, and that's a definite gap for sure.
That's great. Well, thank you.
Well, Neil, this has been fabulous. I think you wondered at the beginning of this conversation whether we could go the full hour. Are you kidding? I think could go another hour. I have a bunch of unanswered questions here. Maybe there'll be a part 2 to this. So,
well, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very, very much for for this today, and your contribution. You're quite a funny and very insightful writer, so it's kind of fun to read your blog.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stephen. I really appreciate it.
That concludes my interview with Neil Bendle. As we learned, much work remains to be done before marketing and finance can ever see eye to eye. Until now, marketing accountability has been an oxymoron. The lack of financial acumen and measurement discipline has undermined the influence of marketing and made CMOs expendable. But finance is equally culpable, overly focused on short-term results at the expense of long-term investments in building brand equity and customer value. But businesses can no longer afford to have marketing and finance mired in an endless war. They need to agree on a measurement model that gives credit where credit is due, and that treats marketing spending as more than a sales expense, but an investment in the growth and health of the business. You can find past episodes of this podcast on customerfirstthinking.ca, where you'll also find articles, strategic frameworks, video, and more on the transformation of marketing. In closing, a big shout out to my friends and colleagues Justin Eacock and Shak Rana for their contribution to making this podcast happen. Until next time, thanks for listening.